Welcome to AI to AGI to ASI, the podcast that tracks the arc of artificial intelligence from where it stands today, through the pursuit of artificial general intelligence to the horizon of artificial superintelligence. I'm your host, and each episode we cut through the noise to bring you the stories, the science, and the stakes that matter most as humanity navigates this transformative era. Today's story sits right at the intersection of frontier AI, national security, and the messy machinery of government procurement. Anthropic is suing the Trump administration over a designation that labels the company a supply chain risk. That phrase can sound like dry bureaucratic jargon, but in the world of critical infrastructure and federal contracts, it carries real weight. It can limit or effectively block a company's ability to sell into government, influence how partners and customers perceive them, and become a kind of reputational scarlet letter. Especially in a sector like AI, where trust, security posture, and access to compute are everything. Let's unpack what's happening, why a leading AI lab would take the unusual step of suing the White House, and what it signals about where AI governance is headed as the US tries to balance innovation with security in an era of geopolitical competition. First, the core of the dispute. The government has apparently tagged Anthropic as a supply chain risk. In the federal context, that kind of label often arises from concerns that a vendor could introduce vulnerabilities into government systems. Through software, hardware, data flows, ownership structures, foreign ties, or operational dependencies. Think of it as a cousin of the kinds of restrictions we've seen applied to telecom and networking vendors over the last decade. But here, we're talking about a frontier AI model developer, one that's become a major player in the race to build increasingly capable general-purpose AI systems. So why would a frontier model lab be treated like a supply chain risk? There are a few plausible vectors that have nothing to do with sci-fi fears and everything to do with how modern AI is built and deployed. 1. Dependencies. AI systems are increasingly constructed on a stack that spans cloud infrastructure, GPU supply chains, model weights, training data pipelines, third-party libraries, and deployment integrations. A supply chain risk determination could be triggered by concerns that any part of that stack is exposed, whether through foreign manufacturing, foreign financing, foreign personnel, offshore subsidiaries, or simply an inability to provide the sort of auditability the government wants. 2. Data. If an AI provider is integrated into government workflows, it can touch sensitive information, even if the vendor swears that data won't be retained, or is segregated, or is processed under strict controls. The government may view any ambiguity about where data goes, what telemetry is collected, what subcontractors are involved, what incident response looks like, as unacceptable. 3. Model behavior and update control. Unlike traditional software, frontier models can change significantly through updates, fine-tuning, or even subtle shifts in safety filters and system prompts. For a government customer, who controls the behavior becomes a supply chain question. If the vendor can push updates unilaterally, the government may worry about emergent behaviors, policy alignment, or unexpected capabilities showing up in production systems. 4. The broader geopolitical lens. The US government increasingly treats advanced AI as a strategic technology. That means the same national security logic used for semiconductors and telecom can migrate into AI procurement and vendor screening. The bar for trusted supplier rises, sometimes in ways that feel opaque to the companies being judged. Now, Anthropic suing the administration is notable for another reason. Most companies try to solve procurement disputes quietly. They negotiate, they lobby, they work through agency channels. Going to court suggests they believe the designation is not only harmful, but procedurally flawed, possibly arbitrary, lacking due process, or based on information the company can't even see or rebut. And that brings us to the heart of what makes this story bigger than a single company's frustration: the tension between secrecy and accountability in national security decisions. If the government says, "We can't tell you why we think you're risky," then it's hard to contest. But if the decision effectively cuts a company out of a major market and implies a serious security concern, then that secrecy can feel incompatible with basic fairness and with the rule of law norms we expect in democratic governance. This is a familiar conflict in other domains. Watch lists, export controls, classified threat intelligence, no-fly lists, systems designed for security often drift toward opacity because the government doesn't want to reveal sources and methods. But when those systems start to shape the economic landscape, especially in a booming sector like AI, they also shape who wins and who loses in the market. And that's when courts get involved. There's another layer here: the signal this sends to the AI industry. If a major lab can be labeled a supply chain risk, one with high-profile backing and a heavy emphasis on safety branding, then smaller AI companies might wonder what criteria are being used, how stable vendor trust really is, and whether any of them could be similarly targeted by shifting political winds. Because make no mistake, this isn't happening in a vacuum. The relationship between Silicon Valley and Washington has been evolving rapidly. On one hand, government wants AI leadership and domestic capacity. It wants secure AI services, AI-enabled defense systems, and a competitive edge. On the other hand, it worries about concentration of power, the opacity of model development, the possibility of leaks or insider threats, and the risk that AI systems embedded in critical functions could become attack surfaces. And beyond those operational security concerns, there's a more subtle issue: dependence. If the US government becomes dependent on a handful of private model providers, it may worry about vendor lock-in, price leverage, policy leverage, and strategic autonomy. In that sense, supply chain risk can also be read as strategic dependency risk. When a technology becomes foundational, you don't just ask, is it secure? You ask, can we rely on it and who controls it? So when we hear supply chain risk, we should hear an entire cluster of anxieties: cybersecurity, foreign influence, operational resilience, and national strategic autonomy. Now let's talk about what this means specifically for frontier AI and the path from AI to AGI and beyond. A major characteristic of the current AI moment is that capability is increasingly concentrated in systems that require extraordinary resources. The best chips, huge datasets, top talent, and massive cloud infrastructure. That creates a landscape where a small number of labs and cloud providers become choke points. In a world like that, national security policy can't just be about protecting networks. It becomes about controlling choke points, managing dependencies, and shaping who can build what. The supply chain risk framing is part of that shift. It's the language of choke points. If you can define a vendor as risky, you can remove them from sensitive deployments. If you can classify certain tool chains, vendors, or hardware as risky, you can steer the entire ecosystem. But there's a catch. AI isn't a single product you install and leave alone. It's a service, a model, an API, a constantly evolving system. It's also increasingly open in some parts of the ecosystem: open weight models, open source inference stacks, fine-tuning tools, while remaining closed and proprietary in others. That means the government's old frameworks for supply chain risk, which grew up around hardware procurement and more static software, may not map cleanly onto frontier model providers. In other words, we could be watching the government attempt to use yesterday's security mechanisms to manage tomorrow's technology. And that mismatch can generate conflict, like lawsuits. Consider what supply chain even means for a model like Claude or any other large language model. The supply chain includes the underlying cloud provider, the GPUs, the networking fabric, the data centers, the model training pipeline, the data sources, the labeling workforce, the reinforcement learning processes, the evaluation harnesses, the safety policies, the red teaming partners, the deployment architecture, and the monitoring infrastructure. It includes upstream vendors and downstream integrators. It includes every place where a malicious actor could poison data, exfiltrate prompts, steal weights, implant backdoors, or manipulate outputs. So the government is right to think in supply chain terms. The question is, how do you assess those risks fairly and consistently, and how do you give vendors a meaningful chance to respond? If Anthropic is arguing that the designation was improperly applied or unsupported, then the lawsuit is also an argument about standards. What is the threshold? What evidence is required? Who decides? What appeals process exists? How do you avoid politicizing the designation? And perhaps most importantly, how do you avoid creating a security theater where the label gets used as a blunt tool rather than a precise instrument? Because in AI, precision matters. If the government mislabels or overreaches, it can do a few kinds of damage at once. One, it can chill innovation. If companies fear arbitrary exclusion, they might be less willing to engage with government, share information, or build secure government-specific offerings. Two, it can fragment the market. If government procurement becomes a separate world with separate approved vendors, you can end up with bifurcated ecosystems, one for public sector, one for private. That can be good for security in some cases, but it can also slow diffusion of best practices and concentrate power among a few anointed providers. 3. It can undermine trust in the risk designation itself. If the public and the industry perceive supply chain risk as political rather than technical, then the label becomes less effective. People stop treating it as a warning sign and start treating it as a bargaining chip. On the flip side, if the government is correct, if it has credible evidence of risk, then this lawsuit raises another crucial issue. How do we secure frontier AI supply chains at all? Because the threat model is real, model weights can be stolen, training pipelines can be compromised, data can be poisoned, inference endpoints can leak information, fine-tuning can introduce backdoors, and sophisticated adversaries, state actors, well-funded criminal groups are absolutely incentivized to attack AI providers, not just for money but for strategic advantage. Frontier AI isn't just another SaaS product, it's an intelligence amplifier. It can help with cyber operations, persuasion, intelligence analysis, scientific research, and potentially military planning. That means the labs building these systems are high-value targets. So when the government worries about supply chain security here, it's not paranoia. It's the logical consequence of AI becoming critical infrastructure. Which brings us to the broader political context implied by the story. The Trump administration is being challenged directly in court by a top AI lab. That's not just a business dispute, it's a sign that AI policy is becoming litigated policy. We've already seen this in other tech domains. When regulation lags behind innovation, courts become arenas where rules are set indirectly through procurement battles, antitrust fights, IP disputes, labor issues, and constitutional claims. AI is now joining that list. If courts end up ruling on what constitutes a fair process for declaring an AI company a supply chain risk, those decisions could shape the governance landscape for years. And here's the key. Governance through procurement is one of the most powerful tools the government has. Unlike sweeping legislation, which is slow and politically hard, procurement rules can move quickly and can shape behavior through incentives. If the government says, to sell AI to us, you must meet these standards, companies will often comply because government is a huge customer and because the standards often become de facto industry norms. So if the government is using supply chain risk designations as a gatekeeping mechanism, it's effectively setting policy through procurement. And if companies are suing, they're trying to shape that policy through litigation. Now I want to step back and ask the question that matters for our theme, AI to AGI to ASI. What does it mean when the leading edge of AI is entangled in national security classifications and supplier trust battles? It means we are moving from the era of move fast and break things into an era of move fast and secure everything. It means the AI race is no longer just a commercial race, it's an institutional race, about who can build systems that are not only capable but governable, auditable, and reliable under adversarial conditions. And it highlights a paradox. To build towards AGI, labs need scale, more data, more compute, more integration into workflows. But the more integrated and powerful these systems become, the more the government will treat them like critical infrastructure. And the more the government will want leverage, oversight, and control. The arc bends toward regulation, whether formal or informal. That's not necessarily bad. But it is destabilizing, especially because AI has a unique trait. It's general purpose. It's not one sector, it's every sector. That means risk assessments can become broad and subjective. Is the risk about code, about people, about corporate structure, about partnerships, about model release strategies, about the ability to comply with future safety mandates, about public statements that suggest a company might resist government directives. When the criteria are broad, the process must be especially robust, or you create incentives for actors to weaponize the ambiguity. Now, consider Anthropic's position in the ecosystem. Anthropic has marketed itself as safety-forward, emphasizing techniques like constitutional AI and a more cautious approach to deployment. Many people would assume that a supply chain risk label would land on a company that's cavalier about security, or that has obvious foreign entanglements, or that's opaque in its operations. So the fact that this label is apparently being applied here, whether justified or not, forces us to confront how complex and political trust can be. Trust in AI is not just about model alignment. It's not just will it say harmful things. It's also institutional trust. Can we trust the company to protect data, to resist coercion, to be transparent with incidents, to implement controls, and to align with national priorities without compromising civil liberties? And that's where things get tricky, because align with national priorities can be interpreted in different ways depending on who's in power. So what might Anthropic be trying to achieve with a lawsuit? At the most basic level, get the designation removed or reversed, or at least force the government to provide a clearer rationale and process. But strategically, a lawsuit can also do something else. It can establish that frontier AI labs won't simply accept opaque designations that materially harm them. It sets a precedent of pushback. It signals to regulators and procurement officials that if they want to restrict a company, they need to do it carefully, with documentation and a defensible process. That kind of push and pull can lead to better governance, or it can lead to hardened positions and slower cooperation. And cooperation matters because securing AI supply chains is not something government can do alone. It needs vendor participation, sharing threat intelligence, standardizing audit processes, developing incident reporting norms, building secure enclaves, implementing reproducible training where possible, improving evals, tracking model provenance, and managing third-party dependencies. If vendors feel the government will punish them arbitrarily, they may be less inclined to collaborate. At the same time, vendors also have incentives to resist oversight, because deep oversight can expose trade secrets, reveal vulnerabilities, slow iteration cycles, and create compliance costs. So the relationship is inherently tense. Government wants assurance, companies want freedom and confidentiality. This is the broader story behind a seemingly narrow headline. Now, let's zoom out to the implications for the rest of the AI sector, especially for startups and open model communities. If supply chain risk becomes a commonly used label in AI procurement, we may see an acceleration of certification regimes, formal security certifications for model providers, stricter requirements for data residency, mandatory third-party audits, controlled update pipelines, and perhaps even requirements around model interpretability or monitoring. For big labs, that's burdensome but doable. They can hire compliance teams and build custom government offerings. For smaller labs, it can be fatal. It could concentrate the market even further, creating a kind of security moat around the largest players. But there's also a countervailing force: open source and open weight models. If government agencies decide that closed, vendor-controlled frontier models are too risky because of lock-in, update control, and opacity, they might favor open models that can be hosted on government-controlled infrastructure. That would be a major shift. It would also create new security problems, because hosting your own models means you own your own patching, monitoring, and incident response. Either way, the procurement choices governments make now will shape the architecture of AI deployment for a decade. This lawsuit is a flashpoint in that architectural decision. There's also an international dimension. Other countries watch how the US treats its AI champions. If US policy starts to look unpredictable, companies may diversify operations or shift partnerships. If the US appears to weaponize security designations, other countries may respond in kind, creating fragmented AI markets along geopolitical lines. We already see hints of this in chip export controls and data localization policies. The world may be heading toward AI blocks, where model supply chains, cloud infrastructure, and standards align with geopolitical alliances. If so, supply chain risk designations become a tool not only of security, but of industrial policy. And industrial policy is ultimately about power, who controls the tools of intelligence. Now I want to address the phrase supply chain risk from the perspective of future AI capability, because it's easy to focus on procurement and miss the deeper thread. As AI systems become more capable, the harm from compromise increases. A compromised enterprise SaaS tool is bad. A compromised system that can draft convincing emails at scale, automate research, write code, reason through operational plans, and adapt to defenses, potentially very bad. If an adversary can implant a backdoor into a model used across agencies, they might manipulate outputs subtly over time, nudging decisions, altering summaries, introducing bias into analyses, or leaking information through covert channels. Model security, therefore, is not an add-on. It is core national security. That's true whether we ever reach AGI or not. But if we do approach systems with broadly general capabilities, the stakes of model integrity become even higher. So in principle, the government is right to be strict. The question is the mechanism. There's a version of this future that is mature and functional. Clear standards, transparent processes where possible, classified processes with meaningful oversight where not. A pathway for vendors to remediate issues and consistent criteria that don't depend on who's in office. And there's a version that is chaotic. Ad hoc designations, political retaliation, companies blindsided, cooperation breaking down, and a climate of uncertainty that weakens both innovation and security. The fact that a major lab is suing suggests we may be closer to the chaotic version than the mature one, at least right now. So what should listeners take away as the durable lessons? First, AI governance is becoming institutional. It's not just about what models can do, it's about who gets to deploy them in sensitive contexts. Procurement, standards bodies, audit regimes, and courts are becoming as important as research papers and benchmarks. Second, trust in AI is multidimensional. Safety alignment is one dimension. Security and supply chain integrity is another. Political legitimacy is another. A company can be strong in one and vulnerable in others. Third, due process matters, especially when security is invoked. Democracies have to be able to act on real threats without turning security into a blank check. If we don't get that balance right, the result won't just be unfair to companies, it will erode the credibility of security decisions, which ultimately undermines actual security. Fourth, the AI industry should expect more of these conflicts. As AI becomes more central to economic and military power, the state will inevitably seek more control. Labs will resist. The battlegrounds will include regulation, export controls, procurement, antitrust, labor, IP, and yes, litigation. Finally, this case highlights an unresolved question in the AI to AGI trajectory. Who will hold the keys? Will the keys be held primarily by a few private labs? By governments? By alliances? By open communities? Or by some hybrid structure with shared oversight? The way supply chain risk is defined and enforced is one way societies decide who gets access to the levers of intelligence. The story of Anthropic suing the administration is a story about a label, yes, but it's also a story about the emerging constitution of AI power, who is deemed trusted, who is deemed risky, and who gets to make that call. And if you're thinking, this sounds like something that will only matter to contractors and policy wonks, remember, these decisions shape what AI tools get embedded into healthcare systems, legal processes, education, public benefits, defense, and critical infrastructure. They shape the incentives for safety and security. They shape which companies survive long enough to compete. They shape whether innovation occurs in the open or behind walls. In other words, they shape the trajectory we're tracking on this show, from today's AI to whatever comes next. That's all for this episode of AI to AGI to ASI. If this conversation resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and make sure you're subscribed so you never miss an episode. The journey from AI to AGI to ASI is unfolding in real time, and we'll be right here making sense of every step. Until next time, stay informed, stay critical, and stay human.